we all want to say it's the conditions that produce who we are, but it's the decisions that produce who we are.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to blame it on something, but it is the decisions. And so just for the sake of this podcast, we were brainstorming and we could probably do another podcast with 10 more of these, right? But we just thought, what are some of the most prevalent mental shifts, areas of focus, things that these guys do that we can thread a little bit into maybe why their church broke 1,000 in attendance. Now, there's things that are not on this list that are very important. High character, high drive, hungry. There's a lot of things that are not on this list, but we just thought, what are maybe 5 things that if I was a church of 300 that's man, I'm hungry to grow. All right. Well, then here's a few areas of focus that seem like, if you want to get where somebody else is, see who he is and what he's doing, this is probably what he's doing.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey guys, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Andrew. I'm here with Pastor Bobby today, and today we're going to talk about how churches of 1,000 plus, some of the mental models they use and ways that they think about things. And I think it's going to be a really awesome podcast for this reason. I think it's incumbent upon us to try our hardest, maybe not to grow to 1,000. I don't think that's a realistic goal for everybody. I don't think that even needs to be the goal for everybody, different contexts and all that. But we are in the game to make disciples, multiply churches. We are trying to grow and go. So when you see guys that have been in situations where they have seen significant growth, I think it's really good for us to think about the models that they're using in terms of the way that they think about things. The problem is many of us get caught in the trap of if-then thinking, okay? And what we need to do is think more in kind of an idea of because now, all right? So if-then is like this. Well, yeah, if I had a church of 1,000, then I would think about and do things the way that they do it, right? And I think what's a better way to think about it is, well, let's see what maybe got them there. Because I'm thinking and doing the things that they're doing, now we are experiencing growth. So not if then, that's a trap. And I think all of us can fall into this victim mindset. Well, if this, then that. And what we need to do is say, no, because I'm going to commit myself to some things, now we're going to actually hopefully begin to see some results. And man, God controls all the results. I fully understand that. But it isn't coming upon us to try to think about things well and do all things to the glory of God. So if you want to get there, instead of saying, when I get there, I'll look and act and think like those people, instead we need to say, well, because I want to get there, maybe there's some ways I need to start thinking the way that they think and actually start that now as a way to get there.
Yeah, totally. It's just so easy in life and so many different things to think, man, my circumstances are going to change and then I'm going to become, a different person to kind of match those circumstances. But we have a lot of different examples here. A lot of times in life, you actually have to become a different person. Something needs to shift internally or shift mentally before you see some of the results that you want to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're going to end up ultimately, hopefully, being able to make decisions that affect change down the road and the way we think about things. I think a good example of this, I got a couple of examples, but we've talked a lot about just personal finance and things like that. Millionaire Next Door was the book in the 90s. Dave Ramsey has done one of the largest studies they claim on millionaires ever. And what they say in that study is that 80% of millionaires never borrow money to buy cars. And it's so funny. Think about if then versus because now, okay? If then says, well, yeah, they're millionaires. If I was a millionaire, then I wouldn't have to borrow money for a car too. And what the study is trying to point out is no, it's because they don't borrow money that now they're millionaires. It's not if then I would, it's because I did, now I am. Those people that are millionaires have habits in their life. They're not rich. They don't not borrow money because they're rich. They're rich because they don't borrow money, and that's kind of the switch that I want us to try to think about today when we're trying to get our minds around this idea of, okay, well, what are some of the mental models that churches that break 1,000, what are things that they're doing or are incredibly important to them? Don't wait to get there and then say, well, I'm going to switch into that mode. maybe the way to get there is to have already switched into that mode. So 2% of churches, according to Barna Research, 2% of churches are ever going to break 1,000. And I would say let's try to learn from some of the ways that they think about things. I think the way that they think about things is going to be a good model for us to try to replicate even at smaller stages in order to help us get there. Proverbs 14, I think, is a good example of this. It says where there are, Proverbs 14:4, I've said this on the podcast before, it says where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of an ox. Now, the traditional interpretation of that, everybody kind of says the same thing, is if you want to have the harvest, you got to also have the mess of an ox, right? And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's always bothered me that this passage doesn't say, some translations have it differently, but like in the ESV, it says where there are no oxen, the manger is clean. Well, what is a manger? The manger is not like the stall that you're, mucking all the, stuff out of, and the manger is where his food is. The manger actually is contains the feed, which is a part of the harvest. And so it's almost like you're saying, hey, when the harvest comes, it's going to come on the back of an ox. But if there is no food, then you're not going to have the ox to produce the harvest. And it's almost like you're in this loop of if then, and it's almost like a never-ending loop. And I think the point of the proverb in some degree is to say, man, somewhere along the way, you just got to start doing the thing that produces the thing that ends up helping you do the thing. Like you got to end up just kind of kicking off that cycle and getting into it. And so today we're going to tackle 5 mental shifts or things that I think are very indicative of churches that run or exceed 1,000. And I think these are applicable to churches of 100 or 200 to say, hey, are you thinking about these things like this now? And it may be a pathway for you to grow. Bobby, you've coached probably dozens of churches that are plus 1,000. And I'm going to get into some different things here, but I mean, generally, what do you see in just the spirit or the way that these guys think about things? Maybe they don't allow themselves to be put in a box. Maybe they're I don't know. I mean, what do you think about, these guys that are able to see churches grow like that, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, some of it is just a mindset of, and I don't say this to be harsh or mean, but I think some of it's just a mindset of like humility, because I think you can meet a couple different guys, maybe their church is 200, and you're going to have one that, if any church larger than them tries to give them any advice, they're going to tell the larger church why the advice won't work or why it's not going to work in their context or, God does it all, so I don't have to think about that stuff. And then you're going to have other guys that they see somebody ahead of them and they have the sort of spirit and humility and heart to say, man, that may not be exactly what I am going to do in my context, but I do want to learn from somebody that's ahead of me, that's a big brother in ministry or that's been doing it for longer. And the funny thing is, to me, the larger, doesn't happen all the time, but a lot of times you meet people that are leading churches of 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000, and they have that type of spirit that I'm talking about. Like you'll get guys where they're over a 2,000 or 5,000 person church, and any church that's ahead of them, they want to learn from them. Like they have the spirit that says, man, these guys are ahead of me. They've learned things that, maybe that I need to learn to get through some of these barriers. And they have that sort of spirit. And part of that spirit is why they got to where they're at.
That's the point. Yeah.
And sometimes it's just a mindset shift, like another just kind of example before we get into the 5 in the podcast here, like I coach people in running, somebody that, wants to run a marathon or they want to do an ultra marathon. And one of the, and I'm ahead of a lot of these people. Like I've done stuff that they want to do, I've done a 100-mile race and somebody comes to me and they want to run their first ultra or whatever. And a lot of times what I have to do is I have to slow them down so that they do their runs slower, because it's one of the things with like amateur athletes that professional athletes do is like, these pro runners, they do their slow runs really slow, like way slower than people would expect. And almost any time I get a newer runner that wants to do one of these goals, they go out and they do all their runs too fast. And so I have to try to get them to shift mentally, like, hey, I know it's counterintuitive, but you're going to have to slow down because you're never going to be able to add the miles if you don't slow down on these easy runs. And so that's one of those things where it's like some people are going to respond to that and be like, okay, I'm gonna have to try to figure that out, because if I ever want to get to where you're at, I'm going to have to be able to run slower. Other people just can't do it. Like they just can't mentally. It's counterintuitive to them, and they just can't do it. And there's just so many examples in life like that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about the humility piece is, I mean, and we obviously know there's other guys out there that are, you know, their church is huge and they're jerks, you know, we know that. But I would say you and I have swum in these waters for a long time, the mega world.
Same thing when you get around a good business guy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's, you know, I don't know, more times than not, way more times than not, I would say, we've seen the opposite be true of like, there are inherent things and decisions that those guys made along character and all that have helped them get where they are. There's other factors too, though. I mean, you know, they're probably in a growing city. They're probably in, you know, so I mean, I get all that. But I think there's such a trap that we think, well, when the growth happens, that's then who I'll become. And it's like, no, you're going to be who you already were. You know, there's no like magic bullet in that. If anything, it's just going to amplify your weaknesses, you know, whatever the cracks are there, if you put growth on top of that. So it's us trying to get the message out of like, man, let's make decisions now that are going to start helping us shape what that future looks like. I heard a guy say the other day, we all want to say it's the conditions that produce who we are, but it's the decisions that produce who we are. Mm-hmm. You know, we all want to blame it on something, but it is the decisions. And so just for the sake of this podcast, we were brainstorming like, man, and we could probably do another podcast with 10 more of these, right? But we just thought, what are some of the most prevalent mental shifts, areas of focus, things that these guys do that we can like thread a little bit into maybe why their church broke 1,000 in attendance. Now, there's things that are not on this list that are very important. High character, high drive, hungry. You know, there's a lot of things that are not on this list. Mm-hmm. But we just thought, what are maybe 5 things that if I was a church of 300 that's like, man, I'm hungry to grow. All right, well, then here's a few areas of focus that seem like, you know, if you want to get where somebody else is, see who he is and what he's doing, this is probably what he's doing. The first thing I would say is, you know, in churches that we've seen them growing like that, the sermon is central. It is a centerpiece of the weekend service. It is something that an incredible amount of energy and time goes into. And it seems like these churches and leaders have embraced a little bit of that, you know, we've talked about it before, YBCHP, yeah, but can he preach principle, meaning you can have all the stuff. You can have the prospectus, you can have the slick business background, you can be a great leader, but there is an element of, you know, the gathered church on the weekends is gathering in a large part, to break open the Word of God and to see it applied to their life. And so that is going to be a big part of, you know, the way that these churches think about their weekend services, and they make no apology for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of the church's resources and weight of social media or whatever, it's going to go into getting that message out, because they really feel like that message is where the power is going to be. They're, you know, and I think these guys somewhere along the way make shifts, hopefully, where they realize, man, I'm not like just running my normal business, if you want to call it that, you know, during the week like a CEO. I'm not pastoring like that all week long. Mm-hmm. And then I moonlight as a preacher on the weekend. Some kind of way they have figured out, like, dude, a big part of what I do is that sermon. And, man, everything else comes second.
Yeah, you have to flip the way you think about it, because we've been around so many guys that say, yeah, but with everything else going on in a smaller church, I don't have time to spend those amount of hours. And I would just say, man, you can't afford not to do it, because this is not a wisdom principle, at least this one, you know, because you look at the book of Acts, they get to Acts chapter 6 and they realize, like, man, the primary duty of a church leader is preaching the word and prayer. Yeah. And we can't get, all these other things are important, you know, and that was the role of deacons in Acts 6. Like, man, we got to do all these other things, but not to the exclusion of what builds the church, right, you know, which is, you know, God's word and preaching God's word. I recently heard a podcast where Joby Martin was talking about, you know, years after he was at 1122, he took like a preaching class online. Like, he committed like a year to take this preaching cohort through somewhere, and he talks about how it wasn't like very helpful for him, but the spirit of it is, just think about that. He's
willing to do it.
He's already at a church larger than us and any church that's probably listening to this podcast. And he's obviously an amazing preacher, and he's focusing on, man, I got to focus on the craft. This is what I do.
That's right.
This is my main role. And so, man, it's just, you got to think about it differently.
Yeah, we need to make sure, and I think that guys at some point, have that shift of, man, I've really got to make sure that I'm not only putting the hours into this, but that I am accounting for that in my normal work life. So it's not just like getting stacked on the top. But I love the way you said about focusing on his craft. It's like, man, thinking, I want to become, it's like the book, become so good they can't ignore you, that kind of idea. That's the Steve Martin quote. And so, I just think that's a really good thought. You're a preacher, 50% of your energy, time, it needs to go into that. I think churches that are growing and have that mindset, they don't let anything else get in the way of that. I kind of cringe a little bit when a pastor's like, the only time I can meet with 2 or 3 different people is 7:00 in the morning or something like that. And it's like, well, that's fine. I'm not judging you at all, because I don't know your work rhythm. But a lot of guys are doing that and sacrificing the deep work time of just like, man, no phone, trying to think about the word. All right, sermon essential. Second thing, I think that these guys eventually accept that their church has a brand and they lean into that brand. Peter and Paul both had an audience they were targeting. I'm walking through Ephesians with my kids right now. And yes, although there were different people, Jews and Gentiles, different nationalities, and the gospel certainly should break down hostilities between those groups. That does not take away Paul's desire, Peter's desire, in terms of mission, to have, a targeted effort. Mm-hmm. And I think that, the way that translates maybe now into a world where there are 4,000, 3,000, churches just in one network, the SBC, in North Carolina. Like, when you have that many churches, I think some of the way that targeting discussion ends up playing out, whether you're thinking about it this way or not intentionally, I think it sort of passively ends up doing this, is it comes out in the way you make decisions and the recipe you're serving up and how you're serving it up. And we've called that on this podcast sort of your brand. There's a lot of different brands. There's guys that are doing different things in our city incredibly well. There's small town, kind of rural. There's a diversity brand where it's like, man, we're really trying to put together a testimony type of environment here for the whole world to see. Intentionality with all types of nationalities and languages and all that kind of stuff. I think there's just straight up seeker type, there's more traditional. I think I've called us like a big box sending, it's kind of like, hey, we're going to try to do programming really well. We're kind of a bigger box church, but at the same time, we're going to be really focused on planting other churches. And that's part of our shtick. Now, all of them have the elements that are necessary to be a good gospel church, right? Like, they're all on mission. They're all doing ecclesiology. They're all trying to care for people. The faithful ones are, but the way they're doing it is differently, and they're maybe even weighting some of those things a little differently, And so you get this really awesome kaleidoscope when you zoom out one rung up and you look at all the different ways that the church is getting after it, just in our community and globally. But I think at some point along the way, churches that break 1,000 seem like they shake loose the guilt that our culture puts on them for sort of having a brand, and instead they embrace it, and they're just like, dude, this is just who we are. It's the type of people we reach. It's the way we can serve up the recipe the best, and you're not going to make me feel a certain type of way about it. Like, we're just going to go for it, man. And I think it really helps them.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think that as churches get bigger, that the messaging or the branding is like more complicated because like there's more people. But in fact, I think when you look at larger churches, a lot of times they've actually simplified the culture. They've simplified the messaging around, man, who is it that we're trying to be?
Yeah.
We're not going to reach everybody in the exact same way. And I think one of the things that this should cause us to do, because you and I have been there, because we've been at Mercy Hill from the time it was just a really small church to where we're at now, there's a tendency to want to keep everybody. You're going to have someone that's like very clear, hey, this person is not a cultural fit in terms of our ministry philosophy or sending or what it is that we're trying to do or the way that we view preaching. And when you're smaller, you're like, I got to keep everybody. When in fact, if you kind of crystallize what the culture is going to be, what the brand is, yeah, you may lose people here and there, but ultimately, I think you're going to have a stronger message and you're going to have a stronger brand. It's just one of those things, counterintuitive.
Yeah, and man, every time I'm on this podcast, I try to have a nugget in there that I'm like, dude, I wish I'd have known that 7 or 8 years ago, right? I mean, there's always one. Don't point it out, but there's always something like that in. This is the little nugget, okay, for me. Man, knowing your brand has got to show up in your values when you talk about ministry philosophy alignment, you know? So like understanding the type of church you are and the things you're going after, some kind of way in the values of your staff, like I'm not talking about your church values, gospel, community mission. I'm talking about your staff values. Man, this is what it means for us to be on staff together and run hard and all that. Something in those values needs to reflect that we have a ministry philosophy. There is a brand that we're going after, you know, and because we've seen this 100 times, like, you know, from different churches, like misalignment there is just going to produce tons of frustration, you know, if you're not aligned around what the brand is and excited about it and be like, yeah, man, this is the type of church that I want to go to and love and want the type of church that I want to serve, you know, and I think our worship style many times is really shaped by that brand. Mm-hmm. You know, at Mercy Hill, we're going to do the top 50 you know, songs that everybody's doing. And, you know, we're going to throw it back to youth camp songs from about 20 years ago sometimes. And, you know, that's kind of what we're going to do, a hymn. We have a lot of SBC roots, so we're going to have a hymn maybe once every other week. There's other churches that are going to be way different than that, you know, way different than that. And that's fine. It's like that's part of, you know, knowing who you are, leaning into that and not saying, well, we want to be sheepish about it, you know, and try to integrate a million different things because we're trying to please everybody.
I think you can more quickly get a lot of people on board with the messaging when you know who you are, and people know that you know who you are, and you can communicate that in a clear way. Because you have to wonder, you know, like a church with like 2,000 or 3,000 in attendance, they probably have 20,000 people in their database, and you say, okay, how are they like bringing along this amount of people? And it's not because of more complex branding, more complex messaging. It's because they have more simplified branding and messaging. That's how they're able to bring along. You think about any good organization or company that you use. You know, a lot of times companies that kind of rise to the top, they understand like who they are, and they have real clear messaging around that, and their customers understand who they are.
Right.
You know?
Totally. Thirdly, I would say that having a bang-up process to move people into your discipleship pathway. Here we call it the weekenders. Some people call it assimilation. Whatever you're going to call it. Like, how do you move people from I have come, I'm a hot lead, you know, right. I've come back, to how do you kind of get them all the way actually in to your discipleship process? We've talked about this on this podcast before. We had a very anemic way of doing that for the first maybe 2 years at Mercy Hill, year and a half, 2 years at Mercy Hill. I was greatly affected by the guys through ARC that do the growth track. We did not have a place to do growth track, or we would have just literally ripped growth track right from them because we were pretty excited about it. So we started something 10 years ago called the Weekender. We've been running it for 10 years. There are churches all over the country running it. I think there's now probably churches that have learned it from churches who don't even remember it came from us.
Right.
But it's you know, it's basically just our way of saying, hey, this is how you get into the discipleship flywheel. It's very focused on the first part of the flywheel, the gathering and serving at the gathering. Bobby, you're into the comms of this. I mean, we communicate this every weekend, basically, right? Yep. Like, how important is it to have something like this that you make the big front door?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I think the trap that people fall into that you're talking about when our church was smaller is you think, man, but we don't have a way to staff this. We don't have a way to fund this. We don't have enough space for this. And so it's just not going to be all that good. And in the future, it's going to be really good when we have a much larger church.
Right.
And it's like, right. It's like, man, the chicken or the egg here.
Yeah.
It's like, well, to get a larger church and to connect with more people, you're probably going to need a better process for this.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think the earlier that you can make this a really good process, and when we say good process, I think it's kind of twofold. It's the event itself, and it's the way that you communicate the event. Mm-hmm. You know, we live in a culture where people come to church all sorts of irregular schedules, and so a lot of times what churches do is man, we do this event, once every 4 months, once every 6 months or whatever. And so they're not communicating it for months at a time. And so people that come at those months that are brand new, they don't have a real clear pathway of how to get connected.
Right.
And what the hope is they hang around long enough and then eventually they hear about whatever process you have. But what we try to do is have something that we're announcing every weekend. So if someone's there for the second time and they hear, hey, if you want to dive a little deeper at Mercy Hill, here's your way to get connected. There's just a real clear pathway for them.
Right. 4th out of 5. I think that churches that grow to 1,000, man, they think about empowering leaders rather than just continuing to create minions of the one pastor, where he's kind of the guru and everybody else is just kind of running around doing all the stuff. I think that, there probably are guys out there that can grow a church, past 1,000 by just having a bunch of minions. They're probably a real alien leader, Most mere mortals, if you're going to see a church grow like that, there has got to be constant restructure and constant empowerment. People given the keys over and over and over and over to go and do more leadership, to take away this idea of there's one guy, he's the genius, everybody else is a helper, he's making all the big decisions, all that becomes a lid so fast. And I want you to talk about that for just a minute, Bobby, because you've kind of been over the restructure time and time again at Mercy Hill, where every time we're growing, we're having to restructure that. And I think actually at the bottom of it, we're setting up systems not so that, me or you even can sit at the top in greater ways. Like we're creating more of a system to where we're trying to hand over the keys of greater and greater leadership for executive teams, senior directors. And it's just, I think it's a really important thing for scalability.
Yeah, when you're scaling an organization, the healthier and larger that organization is, you need people that truly have, they're truly in seats or roles of leadership, where, and that's what good scale is all about, that, you and I are not the only ones that can sit with somebody that's going to be a future community group leader and talk to that person and figure out if they're going to be, the next community group leader. We need to have people under us that are able to do that, and people under us that have ownership. I mean, that is people are everything. I mean, people are everything once the church starts growing, and so we got to put people in empowering positions. The other thing that I'll bring up is, there's a lot of leadership pain associated with this, because there may be people in roles where if you're thinking about, hey, our church is 200, what is it going to look like to be 500? Or what is it going to look like to be 1,000? There are certain people in roles where they're not going to be able to be in that role when the church is 1,000 for whatever reason there may be. And there's a lot of leadership pain associated with that, because you want to honor those people. Some of those people were with you from the beginning, but it's not honoring to them we're in a spiritual war, and
Yep.
we're soldiers in a spiritual war. And so just because someone has tenure, it's not an honoring thing to put them over a ministry that they don't have the character to handle, or they don't have the giftings to handle, and so those transitions are hard, but those are necessary things that we have to do, because, the Bible talks about, spiritual gifts and responsibility. Yeah. And so, we're never harsh with people, and we always have to do it in a spirit of truth and love. But this is a real thing, and this is what keeps a lot of people, their churches, from growing, because they can't make some of these decisions.
Yeah, and the hardest thing is when the character is so high, but the competency part, like you're saying, is just not going to scale. Having an honest conversation about that is really tough. When it's character, it can be a little easier. It's like, hey man, this is just black and white. It's like, is what it is. You can't. But it's when the character's high, which we hope everybody's character's high, like on our staff and stuff. But and then the competency to scale isn't there. It's just very hard. Constantly looking for ways to give away more of the keys. I think that one of the quick tips I would give somebody for this, okay, this is what people think. They think when the church is 1,000, people are going to ask them different types of questions than they do when the church is at 500. And here's the reality. They're going to ask you the type of questions that you make it clear that you're there to answer, whether you're at 1,000 or 500. So one of the things people need to start doing is, man, if a church is 200 or 300 people, the pastor already doesn't need to be the guy to tell you if the donuts are supposed to come from Krispy Kreme or Dunkin'.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so it's almost like you need to do like a question audit. You know, what types of questions keep coming to me? You know, if the types of questions that keep coming to me are just like, man, the smallest, detail-oriented, people don't feel like they got the freedom to make any decision. Like, if that's what keeps coming to me at 200 or 300, you're never going to scale that. Mm-hmm. And instead of saying, well, we'll wait around on the growth and then we'll change it. No, it's not conditions, it's decisions. Make a decision now. Like, say that question is for someone else. That question is for somebody else. Oh, that one's strategy? That's kind of the Michael Fletcher thing we've talked about. If you're the lead guy and the church is growing, you got to get out of the tactics at some point, and you need to get into the strategy. Tactics is, how do you take the building? Strategy is, which building do you take? Mm-hmm. You know, do you take it or not? And we need to be more on the strategy side, different discussion. All right, 5 of 5. Man, having a clear vision. I think that it's a hallmark of churches that are maybe stagnant or not growing, that they don't have something big they're going after and you contextualize that. You know, I understand it from different places, but a hallmark of growing bigger, 1,000-person or more churches is they have some things they're going after that people can tell you about. You know, mm-hmm. I talked to Todd Unziker about this. Well, actually, I didn't talk to him. I heard him say this, and I was really struck by it. I think he's right. He said that he crisscrosses the state. You know, he's over the largest, you know, network of churches in North Carolina. He crisscrosses the state, and he said the hallmark of churches that are growing, mm-hmm. whether they're small or large, mm-hmm. is that they have some mission that they're going after. Whether it be, man, we're going to renovate. You know, we're going to help, you know, 100 kids out of this high school get saved through this reading program, or mm-hmm. we're starting an ESL ministry, or man, we've got this mission endeavor in Honduras, or like there's things that they are very excited about that are missional. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really talk to him about it, but I just thought, yeah, whether they're saying it or not in a pithy way, that stuff's vision. Mm-hmm. You know, they've got some idea, and someone is giving them an idea of what the milk and honey is going to taste like once mm-hmm. they get over the mountain and get into the promised land and all that. And so I just think that having a clear vision is a huge part. You know, we have the vision of 5,500, and it's our way of saying 5,000 baptisms, 500 missionaries by 2032. It's our way of saying this is what we're trying to do. Now, we all know what we're trying to do from Matthew 28 and Acts 1:8 and all that, but this is us putting flesh on it and saying this is our unique contribution to that huge global endeavor. This is what we're trying to do. And then you guys, you know, y'all take that vision and break it down into smaller chunks, you know, for us to go after in quarterly and yearly and all that. I mean, it's kind of how we cast vision.
Yeah, in many ways, I think it ends up supporting all these other ones that you talked about, because what you realize real quickly when you have a clear vision of something you're trying to go after in the future, maybe 5 years from now, you realize, hey, man, we're not empowering leaders good enough, you know, or we have people that need to be in different roles, or man, we need to get somebody in this particular role. Man, there's not a clear enough path for people. Our weekender needs to get better. And it ends up supporting all the rest of the stuff. Hey, we got to be more clear about our brand and who we are and the culture. So yeah, I think having a clear vision, it's just essential, you know, because as the church grows, you cannot sit down with every single person if you have more than a couple hundred people and cast them that vision one-on-one. You got to have a way to, hey, I have this whole group moving in the same direction because we have a really clear vision.
Yeah.
And people just naturally, I remember many, many years ago hearing Dave Ferguson, who's over Exponential, he was talking about they had some vision for, I don't know what it was, 200 campuses in Chicago or something. But I just remember it was like a back of the napkin vision mm-hmm. that you could share with somebody. And I remember hearing it. I'm like, man, that's compelling. Like I could see how that can communicate to a lot of people and get a lot of people moving.
Yeah. And it was funny. I mean, our 5,500 was written on the back of a napkin at one of the Exponential events that Ferguson was talking about that. So it was really awesome. So, hey, biggest idea, just quick conclusion here. Don't fall in to the if-then trap, okay? What if churches don't break 1,000 because they can't break out of if-then thinking? and get into more of a because now idea. Because we did, now we are. Not if we had, then we would. And so, I mean, think about, you talked about running. Like, think about health. Like, how many people say, how many people hear you talk about health or whatever and be like, well, if I had the energy, I would do that.
Right.
They don't realize it's like, well, a lot of guys have the energy because they do.
Right.
That's how they have the energy. There's so many areas of our life that is that way. We think conditions, not decisions. We think if then. And today, I think what we're trying to do is say, hey, on the human side, God's going to do it. He's got to fill the jars. But on the human side, maybe there's no greater determiner of our success than the way that we think about it, the way we think about growth, the way we make decisions and go after it. And so, man, let's chase it and let's think like guys who have already been there and have gotten to that 1,000. Hey guys, we always have one days coming up. There's one every quarter. And man, you could check that out at breakinggrowthbarriers.com. They're incredible opportunities for you to come in. They're 5 hours a time, incredible investment from our church, I think, into the community. And so we're grateful for Mercy Hill and its ability to be able to do that. But man, you really need to take advantage of these if you're trying to grow and go. Thanks.